After my rich aunt passed away, she left me her entire estate instead of her own children, who treated her poorly. Now my cousins are harassing me and want me to share the inheritance with them, even though they never visited her when she was dying. My family is calling me selfish, but I don't think I'm the bad guy here. 6 months ago, I, 28F, was just living my normal life, working a decent but not amazing job as a teacher, paying off my student loans slowly but surely, and occasionally visiting my elderly Aunt Elaine, 72, who'd always been kind to me. Aunt Elaine was my mother's sister, and though she never had a lot of family around, she was one of those people who made an impression on everyone she met. She had married young to a man who made his fortune in real estate development, and after he passed away 10 years ago, she was left with considerable wealth and a beautiful historic home on 5 acres of land outside our city. My cousins Mark, 45M, and Diana, 42F, are her children, but over the years, they've grown increasingly distant from their mother. Growing up, I always felt a special connection with Aunt Elaine. While my cousins were significantly older than me and already adults when I was still a child, Aunt Elaine always made time for me. She would invite me over for weekend stays during summer breaks, teaching me to bake her famous apple pie, letting me explore the little forest behind her property, and telling me stories about her travels around the world. She was sophisticated but warm, the kind of person who could make you feel special just by giving you her full attention. When I was struggling to pay for college, Aunt Elaine quietly helped with some of my tuition. She never made a big deal about it, just told me education was important and that she believed in me. I tried to visit her regularly after graduating, at least once or twice a month. Sometimes we'd just have tea and talk about books we were reading, other times we'd work in her garden together. Simple things, but I treasured those moments. About 2 years ago, Aunt Elaine was diagnosed with cancer. The prognosis wasn't good from the start, but she approached it with the same grace and dignity she showed in everything else. I started visiting more often, bringing her meals when she felt too weak to cook, driving her to doctor's appointments, and sometimes just sitting with her while she rested. It wasn't always easy to fit these visits into my schedule with teaching, but I couldn't imagine not being there for her. During this time, I noticed that Mark and Diana rarely visited. Mark lives about 3 hours away and would call occasionally but only visited maybe twice during her entire illness. Diana lives right in the same city, less than 20 minutes from Aunt Elaine's home, but she was always too busy with her social life and running her boutique to stop by. When she did visit, it was brief, and she spent most of the time talking about herself or complaining about something in her life. I remember one particular visit when Diana showed up while I was there. Aunt Elaine had been having a rough week with her treatments, and I'd come over to help her change her bedding and prepare some meals. Diana breezed in wearing designer clothes, stayed for maybe 40 minutes, most of which she spent showing Aunt Elaine photos from her recent vacation to the Bahamas and barely acknowledging her mother's weakened state. She left without offering to help with anything, promising to stop by more often, a promise she never kept. As Aunt Elaine's condition worsened, I took family leave from my teaching job to help care for her in her final weeks. I essentially moved into her guest room, coordinating with the hospice nurses and making sure she was comfortable. I would read to her when she felt up to it, help her move around the house when she had the energy, and just sit with her, holding her hand when that was all she wanted. During this time, I called Mark and Diana repeatedly to let them know their mother's condition was declining rapidly, but Mark only visited once more and Diana would stop by for 20 minutes at a time, always seeming uncomfortable and finding excuses to leave quickly. The night Aunt Elaine passed away, I was the only family member with her. I had called Mark and Diana earlier that day when the hospice nurse indicated it would likely be soon, but Mark said he couldn't get away from work until the weekend. This was a Tuesday, and Diana said she had tickets to a show that evening but would try to stop by tomorrow. Aunt Elaine died holding my hand, and I like to think she knew she wasn't alone. The funeral was a modest affair, just as Aunt Elaine had requested. Mark and Diana took charge of the arrangements, which mainly seemed to involve complaining about costs despite their mother's substantial estate. I noticed they appeared more concerned about the reading of the will than actually mourning their mother. 3 weeks after the funeral, we all met at Aunt Elaine's attorney's office for the reading of the will. I expected to perhaps receive a small memento or keepsake, as Aunt Elaine had occasionally mentioned wanting me to have her collection of first edition books that we had often discussed together. What I didn't expect was for the attorney to announce that, aside from a few specific items left to various friends, Aunt Elaine had left her entire estate to me, the house, the investments, everything. The room went completely silent. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Mark's face turned a dangerous shade of red, and Diana actually gasped out loud. The attorney continued reading, explaining that Aunt Elaine had updated her will 6 months earlier, shortly after her diagnosis had been changed to terminal. There was a letter included for me, which the attorney handed over in a sealed envelope, saying Aunt Elaine had instructed it was for my eyes only. What followed was chaos. Diana started crying dramatically, saying this couldn't possibly be what her mother wanted, that there must have been undue influence, looking pointedly at me. Mark began questioning the validity of the will, asking when it had been changed and if their mother had been of sound mind. The attorney assured them that everything was in order, that their mother had been fully cognizant when making these changes, and that her wishes were legally binding. I sat in shocked silence, still trying to process what this meant. The envelope felt heavy in my hands. Mark and Diana were now openly accusing me of manipulating their sick mother, of playing nurse to get into her will. The attorney finally had to ask them to leave if they couldn't compose themselves. As we all walked out of the office, Diana hissed at me that this wasn't over, that Blood family deserved that inheritance, not some distant niece who wormed her way in. Later that night, alone in my apartment, I finally opened Aunt Elaine's letter. Her elegant handwriting filled several pages, and I could almost hear her voice as I read her words. She explained that she had watched over the years as her own children had grown distant, interested primarily in what she could give them materially, while I had given her something much more valuable, my time and genuine affection. She wrote that the way I had cared for her during her illness only confirmed what she already knew, that I was the one who truly embodied what family should be. She hoped the inheritance would give me freedom to pursue my dreams, to travel as she had, to live without the financial burdens that had sometimes limited my choices. She ended by saying she was proud of the person I had become and that she loved me as if I were her own daughter. I cried for hours after reading that letter, missing her terribly and feeling overwhelmed by her generosity and trust in me. But I barely had time to process these emotions before the real trouble started. The next day, I received multiple missed calls from both Mark and Diana. When I finally answered Diana's call, she immediately launched into a speech about family obligations and how her mother couldn't have been thinking clearly when she made these changes. She suggested we work something out between the three of us, meaning I should give them what she called their rightful share of the inheritance. When I hesitated, not knowing what to say, she became angry, accusing me of being greedy and selfish. Mark's approach was slightly different. He sent a long email detailing all the ways he had been a good son over the years, how his mother had promised to help his kids, my second cousins, with college, and how devastated his family was not just by losing his mother but now by potentially losing their family home where so many memories had been made, conveniently omitting that he had rarely visited this supposedly precious family home in recent years. Over the next few weeks, things escalated. Diana began telling family members and mutual friends that I had manipulated her sick mother, painting herself as the devoted daughter who was now being robbed of her inheritance. My phone was constantly buzzing with messages from extended family members I barely knew, all expressing their shock at my behavior and urging me to do the right thing by sharing the inheritance with my cousins. Mark took a more direct approach, showing up unannounced at my apartment one evening. He tried to appear reasonable, suggesting we just talk through this like family, but there was an underlying hostility in his tone. He brought up financial difficulties his family was facing, heavily implying that I was responsible for any hardships his children might experience by hoarding their grandmother's money. When I still didn't immediately agree to his demands, his friendly facade dropped, and he warned me that they would contest the will and that it would get ugly for everyone involved. True to their word, Mark and Diana did consult an attorney about contesting the will, but apparently were told they had very little ground to stand on given Aunt Elaine had been of sound mind and the will was properly executed. This only seemed to fuel their resentment toward me. The harassment continued. Diana started posting vague but pointed comments on social media about fake people who pretend to care about family and the truth eventually coming out. Some mutual friends began looking at me differently, clearly having heard only Diana's version of events. Mark's wife sent me a particularly hurtful email about how their children were devastated that they wouldn't be able to afford the colleges they'd been planning on because some distant relative had stolen their inheritance. What hurt the most was when my own parents began suggesting that maybe I should consider sharing some of the inheritance to keep the peace. While they didn't outright say I was wrong, their hesitance to fully support me felt like a betrayal. My mother, especially, seemed uncomfortable with the situation, caught between loyalty to me and not wanting conflict with her late sister's children. She kept saying things like, "I'm sure Elaine would want everyone to be taken care of," despite the clear evidence in Aunt Elaine's letter that she had made her wishes known. About 2 months after the will reading, I finally moved into Aunt Elaine's house. It was a difficult decision, partly because Diana had been telling everyone who would listen that I was circling like a vulture waiting to take over her childhood home. But the truth was, my apartment lease was ending, and it seemed wasteful to continue paying rent when I now owned a house. Plus, I felt closer to Aunt Elaine there, surrounded by her books and the garden we had tended together. The first night in the house was emotional. I wandered from room to room, remembering moments shared with Aunt Elaine in each space. In her study, I found photo albums I'd never seen before, filled with pictures of her travels, her youth, her marriage. There were also several of me throughout the years, carefully preserved. In contrast, there were surprisingly few recent photos of Mark or Diana, though plenty from when they were children. That same week, I received a formal letter from an attorney representing Mark and Diana, demanding financial records and an accounting of all assets from the estate. My own attorney assured me this was largely an intimidation tactic since they had no legal right to this information, but it still felt invasive and stressful. The worst incident happened about 3 months after I'd moved in. I came home from work to find Diana's car in the driveway. Somehow, she had gotten into the house. I later discovered she still had an old key from years ago that worked. I found her in Aunt Elaine's bedroom, going through jewelry and keepsakes, putting certain items into a bag she'd brought. When I confronted her, she didn't even seem embarrassed. She claimed these items had always been promised to her and that she was just taking what was rightfully hers before I sold everything. I told her she was trespassing and needed to leave immediately. She refused, saying it was still her family home regardless of what some piece of paper said. I had to threaten to call the police before she finally left, but not before telling me I was dead to the family and that I would regret being so selfish. After that incident, I changed all the locks and installed a security system. It felt extreme, but I no longer felt safe in my own home knowing Diana felt entitled to enter whenever she wanted. The harassment eventually began affecting my work and mental health. I was having trouble sleeping, constantly anxious about what Mark or Diana might do next. Some days I would sit in Aunt Elaine's garden and just cry, wondering if accepting the inheritance had been worth all this pain and conflict. But then I would remember her letter, her clear wishes, and how she had entrusted me with her legacy. Giving in to Mark and Diana's demands and manipulation would have betrayed that trust. 5 months after the will reading, I finally reached a breaking point. After another family gathering where several relatives made passive-aggressive comments about the situation, I decided to take action. I composed a long email, which I sent to my entire extended family, including Mark and Diana. In the email, I detailed the truth of the situation, how I had been there for Aunt Elaine throughout her illness while Mark and Diana had been largely absent, how she had made her own decisions about her estate with full mental capacity, how the constant harassment and accusations were affecting me. I attached photos of the calendar I had kept during Aunt Elaine's illness, showing my regular visits and the conspicuous absence of my cousins. I explained that I had not asked for or expected this inheritance but that I intended to honor Aunt Elaine's wishes. I ended by saying that while I understood their disappointment, their behavior had become unacceptable, and any further harassment would result in legal action for defamation and emotional distress. The response was mixed. Some family members reached out to apologize, admitting they had only heard Mark and Diana's side of the story. Others doubled down, insisting that regardless of circumstances, inheritance should follow bloodlines and that I was still wrong for not sharing. Mark and Diana themselves were furious, sending scathing replies accusing me of trying to rewrite history and turn the family against them. But something had shifted. The coordinated pressure campaign against me began to lose steam as more people either took my side or at least stopped actively participating in the harassment. My parents, seeing the toll this had taken on me, finally became more supportive, with my mother acknowledging that her sister had made her wishes clear and that I deserved to be respected. Diana eventually moved away, taking a job in another state, though I still occasionally hear through mutual connections that she continues to speak bitterly about me. Mark made one last attempt at reconciliation, or rather, at getting what he wanted, by suggesting we start fresh and that I consider setting up college funds for his children as Aunt Elaine would have wanted. When I politely but firmly declined, stating that I would make my own decisions about any future gifts to family members, he ceased contact entirely. Now, 6 months after inheriting Aunt Elaine's estate, I'm finally finding some peace. I've left my teaching position to pursue a master's degree in literature, something I'd always wanted to do but couldn't previously afford. I've maintained Aunt Elaine's beautiful garden and have even started hosting small reading groups in her sunroom, sharing her love of books with others. I've also established a scholarship in her name at the local community college, specifically for older students returning to education, something I know would have made her proud. The house feels like home now, filled with both memories of Aunt Elaine and the beginnings of my own new chapter. Some days I still feel a pang of sadness about the family relationships that have been damaged, perhaps irreparably. But I take comfort in knowing that I honored my aunt's wishes and the special bond we shared. I sometimes wonder if I should have handled things differently, if there was a path that could have preserved family harmony while still respecting Aunt Elaine's decisions. But then I remember how Mark and Diana treated their mother during her final years, the missed visits, the empty promises, the self-absorption, and I know that giving in to their demands would have betrayed the woman who showed me more love and support than they ever showed her. So, am I the bad guy here? For honoring my aunt's final wishes instead of caving to family pressure? For standing firm against harassment and manipulation? For accepting an inheritance that legally and morally was given to me? I don't think so, but the situation has certainly made me reflect on how money can reveal people's true characters and how family dynamics can shift dramatically when inheritance is involved. I plan to live my life in a way that would make Aunt Elaine proud, to use her gift thoughtfully and meaningfully. And maybe someday, when emotions aren't so raw, there might be room for reconciliation with my cousins. But it would have to be genuine, based on mutual respect rather than financial demands. Until then, I'm focusing on healing and building the future that Aunt Elaine helped make possible for me, carrying her memory and lessons forward in everything I do. Update 1. It's been almost a year since my last post, and I wanted to share some developments in my situation. So much has changed, yet some things remain frustratingly the same. First, the good news: I've completed my first year of graduate school and am thriving academically. Using part of Aunt Elaine's inheritance to pursue higher education without financial stress has been incredible. My professors have been encouraging about my work, and I've even had a paper accepted for publication in a literary journal. I know Aunt Elaine would be proud. She always believed in my academic potential even when I doubted myself. The scholarship I established in her name has already helped 3 returning adult students begin their college journeys. I met them at a small ceremony last semester, and hearing their stories about overcoming obstacles to pursue education later in life was deeply moving. One woman, in her 50s, reminded me so much of Aunt Elaine with her determination and grace. Creating this legacy feels like the perfect way to honor my aunt's memory and values. I've settled into the house completely now. The garden is thriving. I've maintained Aunt Elaine's beloved roses while adding a vegetable patch of my own. The reading group that meets in the sunroom has grown, and these monthly gatherings have become a highlight for me. Several of Aunt Elaine's old friends participate regularly, sharing stories about her that help me feel connected to her still. Now for the complicated part: family relations remain strained, though there have been some unexpected shifts. Diana has maintained her distance, occasionally making bitter comments on social media or to mutual acquaintances, but has otherwise stopped direct contact. Last I heard, she's doing well professionally with her relocated boutique, which I'm genuinely glad about despite our differences. Mark, surprisingly, reached out about 3 months ago. His email started formally, almost businesslike, but gradually shifted to a more vulnerable tone. He admitted that he had been reflecting on his relationship with his mother in the years before her death and acknowledged that he hadn't been as present as he should have been. He stopped short of apologizing for his behavior after the will reading but did express regret about how things unfolded. The most revealing part came when he mentioned that his oldest son, 19, had asked to visit the house, wanting to see his grandmother's home one more time and perhaps collect some memories. Apparently, my cousin's son had been close to Aunt Elaine when he was younger, something I hadn't known. This request seemed to have triggered Mark's reflection about his own relationship with his mother. After careful consideration, I invited my second cousin to visit. He came alone, not with his father as I had half expected, and spent an afternoon looking through photo albums and walking the grounds. He told me stories about summers spent here when he was little, before his family moved further away and the visits became less frequent. It was bittersweet hearing these memories from a perspective I hadn't considered before. Before leaving, he asked if he could take one of his grandmother's gardening books that had special meaning to him. Apparently, she had taught him about plants during those summer visits, much as she had done with me. I was happy to give him the book, along with a small framed photo of him and Aunt Elaine that I had found in her study. His gratitude seemed genuine, and for the first time, I felt a connection to that side of the family that wasn't tainted by the inheritance conflict. This visit apparently made an impression on Mark. A week later, he called me, our first actual conversation in nearly a year. He was less confrontational than I expected, asking about the house and how I was doing. He mentioned that his son had come back with positive things to say about our meeting and the changes I'd made to the property. There was an awkward moment when he brought up the inheritance again, saying he was still trying to understand his mother's decision, but he didn't push for anything specific. I kept the conversation polite but guarded, unwilling to open myself up to more manipulation. I did, however, invite him to visit himself if he wanted to see the house or collect any personal mementos that might have sentimental value to him. He didn't immediately accept but said he would think about it. My own parents have finally, fully come around to supporting me. My mother, especially, has become more vocal in family circles about respecting Aunt Elaine's wishes and standing up for me when others bring up the situation. This change came after she spent a weekend at the house and saw all the ways I was honoring her sister's memory, from maintaining specific aspects of the home exactly as they were to continuing traditions Aunt Elaine had valued. I think seeing this helped her reconcile her mixed feelings about the situation. Not everything has been resolved, though. Last month, I discovered that Mark and Diana had been telling extended family members that I had sold off most of Aunt Elaine's valuable possessions and completely gutted the historic character of the house, neither of which is remotely true. I've been meticulous about preserving the home's character while making only necessary updates for safety and comfort. As for possessions, I've kept almost everything of significance, only donating some clothing to charity as Aunt Elaine had specifically requested in her notes. These rumors led to an uncomfortable exchange at a family wedding 2 weeks ago, where a distant cousin confronted me about destroying Elaine's legacy. After calmly correcting these misconceptions and inviting her to visit the house herself to see the truth, I realized that Mark and Diana are still not above spreading misinformation to paint me in a negative light. This realization was disappointing but not surprising. I've come to accept that some family relationships may never be fully repaired, and I'm focusing my energy on the positive connections in my life instead. The reading group friends, my supportive colleagues, and the few family members who have stood by me form a chosen family that feels more genuine than some of my blood relations. Financially, I've been careful with the inheritance, investing most of it while using some for education and maintaining the property. I consulted financial advisors to ensure I'm being responsible with these resources. Aunt Elaine's attorney, who has become something of a mentor to me through this process, recently told me that she would be proud of how I've handled everything, both the assets and the family conflict. Coming from someone who knew her well for decades, this validation meant a great deal to me. There have been moments of doubt, particularly when the family conflict resurfaces. Sometimes I wonder if sharing some portion of the inheritance might have preserved those relationships. But then I remember Aunt Elaine's clear wishes expressed in her letter, and I know that honoring her decision was and continues to be the right thing to do. She chose me as her heir for specific reasons, having watched how all of us behaved throughout her life and especially during her illness. As the one-year anniversary of receiving the inheritance approaches, I'm planning a small gathering in Aunt Elaine's garden, a celebration of her life with the people who truly cared about her. I've invited her closest friends, my supportive family members, and even Mark and his son, though I'm not sure they'll attend. It feels like the right way to mark this milestone and to continue transforming what began as a painful family conflict into something healing and positive. Looking ahead, I'm at peace with my decisions and grateful for the opportunities Aunt Elaine's generosity has provided. The inheritance was never just about material wealth, it was her way of acknowledging the genuine bond we shared and ensuring that someone who truly cared for her would be the steward of her legacy. That responsibility is something I take seriously every day, and I hope that wherever she is, she can see that her trust in me was well placed.